But let's start with the obvious. It's one of those moments that's still hard to process in real time. I think most people, regardless of ideology, are going to wish this operation against Iran turns out to be a success. I count myself among those who do. But I'm also among those who are deeply uneasy with this decision. Because what if we just open a door we can't close? Let me back up for a moment and remind folks how we got here. For all its failures, nuclear deterrence has actually worked more often than not. The number of countries with nuclear weapons is fairly limited. And in some cases, we've actually seen nations abandon their ambitions entirely. Brazil did, South Africa did, Libya. And while each case was different, the idea of preventing a nuclear arms race in the Middle East has always been a core tenet of global security strategy, not just the United States. That fear, a nuclear Iran, has haunted multiple U.S. presidents, because if Iran goes nuclear, then so does Saudi Arabia, and so do the Emiratis. Egypt will want one, and suddenly we're living in a new Cold War, but in the hottest region on Earth. So yes, preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon is a broadly supported objective. But that's not the same thing as saying bombing is the only or best way to achieve that goal. Let's not kid ourselves. This was a choice. There's a famous question that one of my predecessors at Meet the Press once put to George W. Bush about the Iraq War: a war of necessity or a war of choice? It was a question that he never fully answered, but in hindsight, it certainly looks like it was a war of choice. This decision was a choice. There were other ways to go. President Trump, though, now owns this choice. It is perhaps the single most consequential decision he has made and may make for either one of his terms as president. There was no imminent threat. There wasn't even a preemptive strike. This was at best a preventative strike, and it's a very risky one at that. Now, look, if there's one constant in Trump's foreign policy instincts, it is this: he believes in maximum pressure and minimal consultation. He thinks he can airstrike his way out of problems. And sometimes I use the word airstrike metaphorically, like tariffs are kind of his version of this. He thinks he can do this economically, militarily, diplomatically. And maybe he can in an instance or two. Many of us should hope he's right about this one. I do, because the alternative could be a hell of a lot worse. But this just isn't a regional skirmish. This reverberates across the globe. Think about the signal this sends to Ukraine. America is slow walking its commitment there, while fast tracking a bombing campaign in Iran. If you're President Zelensky, you're just shaking your head. Now, if you're Vladimir Putin watching this unfold, you're thinking, good, the Americans are distracted, and we get to keep testing the limits. America's going to be more focused on that than us. And of course, there's the supposed alliance between Russia and Iran. But let's be honest. We've seen some early rhetoric from Medvedev and some others. Russia is not going to stick its neck out for Iran. Putin is transactional, not fully ideological, and he knows he's got the best U.S. president he'll ever have when it comes to his ambition in Ukraine. Why mess that up by irritating him in Iran? Trust me, he will trade Iran for Ukraine in a heartbeat. And I don't know if Tehran knows that yet. Iran may get some rhetorical support like they got, but when it comes to real resources, I have a feeling they're going to be on their own. We'll see, but if you're him and you know you're dealing with a bit of an erratic guy in Donald Trump, do you want to test the limits? And suddenly he's decided, oh, I'll fully arm Ukraine. Let's go. Meanwhile, what kind of message is being sent to other countries teetering on the nuclear threshold? North Korea built its arsenal, and like it or not, they secured a kind of leverage. They have their own nuclear umbrella that protects them. Libya gave up its program back in the early 2000s. And how long did Gaddafi get to stay in power? That history is not going to be lost on Iranian hardliners. What if, under the guise of trying to prevent Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon, we just sped up their ambition? Just something to ponder here for a minute. Now, look, it's impossible to talk about this without acknowledging Israel's role. And I know there's some folks out here who are angry at Israel over how they've managed Gaza and how they've dealt with the humanitarian crisis that's unfolding there. But two things can be true at the same time. That how they've handled Gaza and how they've done the humanitarian aspect of this has been atrocious. And at the same time, it's a righteous cause to go after Iran. Iran is not a good regime. These are bad people committed to doing bad things, committed to the eradication. These people do not share our values. They don't share a lot of values with anybody who's high character. So look, that's just a fact. But still, Israel played a major role in cornering the United States into this airstrike. Israel's government has been increasingly skeptical, if not hostile, to diplomacy with Iran. They didn't like the first Iran agreement, and they were petrified Trump would do a similar agreement. And then you can't ignore the domestic political context in Israel. The bombing occurred just hours before Prime Minister Netanyahu was set to face a no-confidence vote, where two of his furthest right hardline parties were thinking about essentially bolting the coalition and forcing an election. A coincidence? Perhaps. But the political incentives for escalation are undeniable there for him. Look, Netanyahu's views on Iran he does view Iran as an existential threat. And he sees this moment as a rare opportunity. Iran is very weak, internally divided. They've lost key regional footholds in Syria and Lebanon. Israel, of course, couldn't get rid of the nukes on their own because they didn't have that kind of weaponry. They needed U.S. muscle, and they got it. And here's something that is probably going to be an unpopular take with many of you. I believe it wouldn't have mattered who was U.S. president. I think this bombing campaign would have happened under Kamala Harris presidency as well. Why do I think that? The only difference is, and I talked with a few experts on this, the only difference is I don't think Bibi waits 60 days. He gave Trump 60 days. I don't think Bibi was going to wait 60 days. But either way, he was going to corner the next American president regardless to sort of force, because once Israel attacked Iran, there was no pulling back. There was no amount. There was no diplomacy left to have. It wouldn't have mattered if it was a President Harris or a President Trump. And then the moment of truth would have come. And again, this was a strategic, there's no doubt he was persuaded that this was a strategic opportunity that that the previous presidents never had a chance at having. To attack Iran with no Hezbollah to worry about, to attack Iran with none of theirs, with Assad already out of power. So these were things that a Bush didn't have, an Obama didn't have, even a Biden didn't have. So I'm not saying it's a guarantee that this happens under either presidency, but I think it's more likely than many of you may realize because of the circumstance and because Israel was going to force the hand of the next American president regardless. They did not view any sort of deal, sanctions relief, as anything that was going to be helpful to them in the region. And they've been on the front line of these attacks from Iran for a generation. Make no mistake.